3 applications required. One was a conditional use permit to increase the height of the building from 4 stories to 5 stories. One was a variance of the FAR from 2.04 to 2.41, and then site plan review. All 3 of those applications were approved at the Planning Commission meeting. And this morning, the appellant has appealed the approval of the variance for the FAR. At the Planning Commission meeting, there were conditions added to the site plan review or to the applications, and one of those applications required that the 5th floor on the south side of the building be stepped back 10 feet, similar to the 5th floor on the west side of the building. And that results in a smaller and less bulk, and that reduces the FAR down to 2.39. However, because the maximum is 2.04, there is still a variance required, but it is slightly less. The appellant has appealed the decision of the Planning Commission and does not believe that the FAR variance should be granted until soil on the site has been tested by an independent party and shown to contain levels of hazardous material that would make excavation of an underground parking garage impractical. So that is the rationale behind the appellant's appeal this morning. And I will let the appellant speak to that. And then in your packets today, and I have shared this with the appellant, the applicant or the developer did submit information about soil contamination, so that was provided to you for background information. And just to show you the site quickly, and then I will conclude. This is the site plan for that building. So 26th and Stevens, you can see that the bulk of the building then is concentrated on that north and east sides of the site, and then a parking lot on along the alley. And this is the site here, and you can see it's 2 blocks from Nicollet. So that is the item before you this morning. I'll stand for questions.
Are there any questions for staff? Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what is the status right now? It is contaminated soil, you're saying? Or
the site has been a Superfund site going back several years, decades. There is information. The site is contaminated at a certain level, and I will let the applicant speak more to that during the public hearing.
All right, thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, there are none. So we will open the public hearing for item number 2, beginning with the applicant first. So the developer, and then we'll move to the appellant immediately following that, and then we'll open it up for anyone else who would like to speak.
Good morning, council members. I'm Carol Lansing, attorney at Faegre Baker Daniels, working with the applicant CPM Development. I'm going to say just a few words about the FAR variance, and then Ken Haberman, who's the environmental consultant, is going to give you kind of a summary of what the soil conditions are and why building slab at grade is appropriate. Also here, if you have questions, is Daniel Oberpriller with CPM Development and Scott Nelson, the architect. The variance is required. We are not able to build underground parking. It doesn't make sense on this site. If we could build underground parking, this project would be eligible for a second density bonus, which would bring it up to 2.38. We're at 2.39. So really, we're talking about a building we could build without a variance, but for the soil conditions. But I also wanted to just point out that it's also a very suitable, appropriate building in this context. The site is C2. 26th Street has commercial and high density zoning all along it. Goes in several lots. It's not just that we're bringing a lot of high density into an area further south that doesn't have it. There's also R5 on this street. R5 allows higher FAR base than C2 does, and OR3 even higher. So C3 also allows it higher. So we think, despite the variance, that this is very context appropriate. And so with that, I'll let us get to the main issue with Ken Haberman talking about the soil conditions. Unless you had a question.
Good morning. Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Ken Haberman, and I work for a company called Landmark Environmental. This past summer, we were hired by CPM in Corson's Corner to conduct a phase 1 environmental site assessment. Through that process, the previous historical documents and reports related to this property were reviewed and summarized. And based on that Phase 1 report, the information that's been publicly available for some time was summarized. And what that indicated was back in 2005, there was soil remediation down to a level of approximately 10 to 12 feet. The soil was removed, hauled off site to permitted landfill, and replaced with clean fill. What wasn't removed was really the most significant soil contamination, and that soil contamination remains, and it starts at a depth of approximately 12 feet and goes down to a depth of approximately 25 to 30 feet. In order to remedy that particular soil through the review and approval of the Pollution Control Agency under the Superfund program, there was a soil vapor extraction system installed. That system is still in place. It includes 16 vapor points or extraction wells and groundwater monitoring wells. Based on the information and the findings from the Phase 1 assessment, we conducted additional investigation through a supplemental Phase 2 investigation. Through that process, really, we just verified what, again, the historical documents and the remediation work had done back in 2005. And again, the soil in the top 10 to 12 feet is clean, but there's a significant amount of soil left in place. Based on that Phase 2 investigation, we submitted the reports to the Pollution Control Agency in the middle of October. They are in the process of reviewing those reports. This past week, we submitted a voluntary response action plan, which is a cleanup plan that addresses continuing to operate. And one of the things that the Pollution Control Agency staff was very clear about was the current soil vapor extraction system needs to stay in place. It needs to be reconfigured and reinstalled in the new building, but it needs to stay in place. And so out of that process, the soil that's contaminated with tetrachloroethylene, which is a dry cleaning solvent, and petroleum contaminants, will continue for years to come to be extracted through a vapor phase. And so that SVE system, the soil vapor extraction system, needs to continue. One of the documents we reviewed in the Phase 1 was the Minnesota decision document, which is a summary document the Pollution Control Agency put together in 2007. One of their recommendations in that document was that any future development be constructed slab on grade, because they knew that that soil contamination was going to remain and that this soil vapor extraction system needed to continue. If in fact there's an underground parking garage or a basement or any significant soil excavation, that soil vapor extraction system, which actually was paid for by Hennepin County, would need to be removed and reinstalled rather than essentially just reused if it's a slab on grade type of building. So that's part of our recommendation in the voluntary response action plan, is to keep the system in place and not remove it. The other component, and really the primary purpose that the Pollution Control Agency had and our recommendation, is the closer that you get to having indoor space close to that contaminated soil, the higher the risk of the vapors from that system entering the building. Vapor intrusion, vapor migration is a very significant environmental issue on a number of properties. I'm sure you've heard about it. In this particular case, it will continue. We've met with the Pollution Control Agency. They understand what the cleanup plan is. It's under review. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
I do have a question related to that issue. One of the items in our packets is a communication from the PCA to the appellant. And in that communication, the project manager from the PCA had communicated that they hadn't received an application from the developer related to the VIC program. Could you comment on that program and what that means for the status of the communications with the PCA?
The phase one environmental site assessment that I mentioned that was put together was submitted to the Pollution Control Agency through the Voluntary Investigation and Cleanup Program. This is a program I'm fairly familiar with. I worked for the Pollution Control Agency for a long time, and 7 of those years I was the manager of that particular program. So the application was submitted on October 14th, and subsequently they've gotten all the other phase 2 reports and the response action plan.
Any other questions? Council President.
Thank you.
Matt,
Sorry, we do have a question
just one question.
from Council.
Does eventually this vapor extraction system eliminate the contamination entirely, or what's the long-term prognosis?
It's a very slow process. It's really meant to control the situation so that the vapors that would naturally go out into the neighborhood from this contaminated soil are captured. For a number of years when the system was operating, initially it was removing such a high level of tetrachloroethylene, of this dry cleaning solvent, that the exhaust from this SVE system needed to be run through a carbon filtration system. It has been effective in that the Pollution Control Agency a couple of years ago decided that the emissions weren't nearly as significant as before based on a lot of monitoring, years of monitoring. And so that carbon filtration system has been removed and is no longer required. But it's a process that literally will take years and years and years to remediate all of the material. Part of the issue is one of these geological issues. The soil that's contaminated is a heavy clay. And if this had been sand or gravel, it likely would have been down 60 feet into the groundwater and or vaporized. But it's literally being held in place. And so that's why the PCA staff has said the system needs to continue as long as necessary. And I don't think anybody can, including the PCA, predict how long that will be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I do think it would be helpful for the applicant to talk through perhaps the architect, how this building has been designed to interact with the properties to the south.
Good morning. I'm Scott Nelson with DJR Architecture. We use the site plan. Raised up a little bit. We have to the properties to the south. We provided the drive to the parking area and the access to the parking lot on the south side of the property. So it increased the setback from what would be required to approximately 30 feet to get the largest setback that we would have on that side. And also through the actions of the Planning Commission, one of the conditions of approval was to step back the 5th floor, which we did. This is a rendering of the revised east elevation of the project that will show the step back of the 5th floor to 10 feet. We originally had another sort of parapet increase on that side, but one of the conditions was to step back the 5th floor. So that was a change that was made and reduced the FAR by 640 square feet.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just curious, which street is in front of this?
This is the Stevens elevation.
Stevens, gotcha. Do you have any depictions of 26th as well?
The 26th. And you can see we had been stepping back the elevation at the corner of 26th in the alley as well.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions for the applicant? Okay, with that, we will invite the appellant to please come. And after this presentation, we'll have anyone else who would like to speak. Scott. That's
Good morning, everybody. I thank you very much for agreeing to listen to our appeal. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an environmental consultant. I am a neighbor who happens to live right next to this property. I'm speaking on behalf of a group of neighbors who all live around the perimeter of this site, and we are all co-signatories to a document that I think you already received as a part of the original package for the original variance request. The reason that we're here today is because based on some comments that we heard at the end of the Planning Commission, we had the impression that commission members were sympathetic to some of our concerns, but they did not feel that based on the amount of information that they had available at that time, they had the authority not to approve the variance. So what we're hoping to do now is to provide a little bit more information that will give you that authority if you feel that you should need it. This is just to remind everybody of our perspective about the suitability of the site. This would be the largest residential mixed-use building in Whittier, 70 units, 70,000 square feet. It is not on a designated commercial corridor. It is not in an activity center. It is on a site that is immediately adjacent to two different clusters of single-family homes. To help you visualize, this is the street view from the property line. The property line is right here, facing south on Stevens Avenue, so that certainly doesn't seem like a high-density neighborhood to me. This is the properties on the other side of the back side of the property on First Avenue. That's my house right there. So we feel that it would be an unusual decision to approve a variance for a building to increase another 20% under any circumstances, but it's particularly the case in relationship to this site because the development has a considerable level of resistance from the neighborhood. Hundreds of residents and several local business owners have signed a petition expressing concerns about the size and urging the Planning Commission not to approve the request for a variance, and the Neighborhood Association also did not approve the request for a variance. So this is an unusual decision to approve this variance request for several different reasons. There were two principal justifications that were given for the decision. One has to do with an understanding of the zoning and the history behind the zoning, and the other having to do with an understanding of the condition of the soil. So those are the two things that I really want to address right now. First, regarding the zoning itself, it is Zone C2. At least one member of the Planning Commission in his comments at the end suggested that he believed that the site had been Zone C2 since the early 1990s, suggesting that those of us who live next to the site had purchased property knowing that it was next to a site that was Zone C2 and that a building like this could go up. So this echoed some comments that we had also received from the applicant in our conversations with them. Just to set the record straight on that score, the zoning was R2B until 2005. And all of the other signatories to our joint document, except for myself, I moved into the neighborhood in 2006. All the other signatories were already residents at that time. And the circumstances of the change in zoning are also relevant here. There was an extensive consultative process that involved Hennepin County, the Whittier Alliance, the stakeholders on the block, the MPCA. That was an initiative to try to get a development in this site without waiting for it to be completely free of toxic materials. Several of the people that are sitting to my left were involved actively in this consultation process. And the end result, I understand they were bussed around town to look at various buildings. They talked to people about the conditions of the soil. They talked to architects. The end result of that process was this design, a mixed-use building with, I believe, 14 townhouses and some commercial on the corner of 26th and Stevens Avenue. The zoning change was approved by the neighborhood specifically because it was connected to this site design. And this site design was approved precisely because it was understood as a way to preserve the low and medium density residential character of the street and to ensure that there would be housing here that would encourage long-term residents with families. In other words, it is exactly the opposite of the kind of building that is now being proposed. And if the residents at the time had known that by approving a change to C2, they were going to get a building like this instead of like that, they never would have approved it to begin with. Now, obviously, zoning is zoning. We are not saying that we can go back in time. We're not saying that the applicant should not be allowed to build a building on this site that conforms to zoning. But we do feel relatively strongly that because of this history, the zoning limit for a C2 property should be considered the upper limit of what is appropriate at the site, not the beginning of a conversation of even greater density, which in other circumstances could be perfectly appropriate. Again, if this were on a commercial corridor, if this were in an activity center, if this were on a designated block, if it had neighborhood approval, these would all be reasons why it would make sense to have an even bigger building. None of those conditions are operative in this case. So that's the history of zoning. That's sort of part one of our presentation. Okay, now let me turn to the question of the condition of the soil. First of all, let me just clarify that because we're concerned about the size of the building, first and foremost, we're investigating the condition of the soil because it's being used as the primary justification for granting the variance. It actually is not our preference that this site have an underground parking lot. It is our preference that it not have an underground parking lot and it be 20% smaller. But even a site with an underground parking lot would still be 10% less massive than the current site because about 10% of the building on the first floor, more than half of the first floor is now an above ground enclosed parking lot, which does not count in the calculation of the FAR. So if that were underground, the building would be at least 10% less massive. That's about 7,000 square feet. That's 5 to 6 times the size of my house. It certainly seems like a significant difference. Okay, that said, as you've just heard, the applicants are, it's their position that the condition of the soil makes an underground parking lot impossible. They've also said that because of the risk of vapor migration, that it is also not possible to put ground floor residential units, which is the reason why they have an extra floor added to the building and they have a ground floor parking lot. Okay, there are a couple of reasons why as neighbors we found this to be surprising and confusing. The first is that that building that was designed and approved by the MPCA has both an underground basement and ground floor parking, and ground floor residential. So we couldn't really understand why a site that was approved 10 years ago, before we spent $1.3 million and a decade to clean up the site, was feasible with residential on the ground floor and with a basement. And now all of a sudden, despite the fact that the soil is much cleaner, neither of those items are possible any longer. So this was one thing that confused us about the claims that the applicants were presenting. The second thing was that as neighbors, we saw a lot of activity in the property just around the time that the applicants first presented their design to the Whittier Community Issues meeting. I think that was in July. It looked like both drilling to sample the soil and then also the removal of some large containers from the structure that houses the soil vapor extraction unit. So we were curious about exactly what that involved, and it seemed to us that something had fundamentally changed about the condition of the soil, and we never saw any reference to that at any point in any of the applicants' presentations. So after the planning meeting on October 5th, we followed up with the MPCA. In fact, Dave LaViolette, who's sitting at the end, contacted Stephen Schaff even before the October 5th meeting, but I followed up with him thereafter. And we found out a couple of things that took us by surprise. First of all, although we could see people taking soil samples in July, the MBCA had no knowledge that soil samples had been taken at any time more recently than 2009, and they also had had no contact with the applicants at all up until that point. So that is really why we decided to appeal, because for two reasons, really. First of all, as neighbors, we are also victims of pollution at this site. Many of us have had our property contaminated. Many of us have had remediation systems installed. And we've been told that those make our basements safe and that the SVE system has been successful in removing lots of toxins from the soil. If that's not the case for our own personal safety, it seems relatively important that we understand that. On the other hand, if that is the case, we certainly don't think that it's fair that a misrepresentation of the current condition of the soil should be used to force us to accept a building that we don't want, that does not conform with city ordinances, and that does not have neighborhood approval. So let me respond individually to each of the points that have been laid out in the applicant's response to our appeal. Excuse me, I'm very thirsty. The first has to do with okay, right down here on the bottom of page 5 of the applicant's appeal, it says, it is assumed that an underground parking garage would require excavation to a depth of 12 to 15 feet and likely deeper in some locations for footings to accommodate the installation of an elevator. I think here the suggestion is that although the soil is cleaned down to a depth of 12 feet, that that's not quite deep enough to be able to avoid digging down into the soil that contains contamination underneath that level. And I think here what we might have is a slight disconnect between the perspective of somebody who's looking at the soil and the perspective of somebody who's worried about zoning. So as it turns out, the property is already significantly below street level. That's because during the soil reconditioning in 2005 and 2006, about 6,000 tons of soil were removed from the site. Here, you have a copy of this in your packet, but this is a topographical survey of the property that was prepared by Mickey Garrity, who lives across the street on Stevens. He's sitting right here. As you can see, the level of the soil ranges from about 1 to about 4 or 5 feet below street level. And the reason why this is important is that because this property is zone C2, it has to be not set back from the street. And in order to do that, it has to be at the level of the sidewalk. So this building actually has to be raised up from the level of the soil between 3 and 5 feet in order to conform with zoning. So if you add that 3 or 5 feet to the 10 or 12 feet, seems to me like we certainly have enough room to be able to put an underground parking garage down there. Okay. Also, there's the question about the footings and the elevator. It's my understanding that I need to give you another. Right. So it's my understanding from looking at the soil samples that were provided by Landmark that the most significant levels of contamination in the clay are at this site. This is actually not part of the construction site. It's in fact closer to my house than it is to the construction site. That's either good or bad depending on your perspective. But this area of the property is largely free of contaminants even at this lower level of the clay. So I think that this concern could be addressed relatively easily by having the elevator on that side of the property. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course. Right, point number 2. So this is the question about the cost involved in removing and reinstalling the soil vapor extraction unit. Here again, I think we might have a disconnect between somebody looking at this from the perspective of the soil and somebody looking at it from the perspective of zoning. What Landmark's recommendation says is that it's not practical to build an underground parking lot because it would involve removing all as opposed to just part of the SVE system. I think part of the confusion here is that they are assuming that in order to qualify for the density bonus, they would need to have as many parking spaces as are at the current site, and they would need to have parking spaces in the same situation as they are in the current site. However, they only need 35 spots to qualify for the density bonus. There are already 26 spots here. So it seems to me that the entire underground parking lot could easily be fit into just this part of the building. In other words, they would not have to excavate any more of the lot than they already do for the current design. Now, that is not to say that there wouldn't necessarily be some added costs involved in building an underground lot, removing and reinstalling this part of the SVE system. I don't know exactly what those costs would be. They would have to be offset by some significant savings that are represented by building at this site as opposed to another site, namely the fact that previous construction has been removed at taxpayers' expense and the fact that 6,000 tons of fill have already been removed at taxpayers' expense. I think that alone represents $180,000 of savings, more or less. I can't say if it would be therefore more expensive or less expensive to build an underground parking lot at this site as opposed to another site. But fortunately, it's my understanding of variance considerations that cost effectiveness is not supposed to be the basis of your decision. It's only a question of practicality. It seems to me quite clear that if it were impractical to remove and replace part of the SVE system, they wouldn't be building this building at all. I also would add, underground parking is by its nature expensive. I think it runs $25,000 to $30,000 a spot. A 35 spot lot would be $1 million. So cost effectiveness can't really be a standard here because it is never cost effective to build a parking lot if you have the option of not building it and still getting the density bonus. So I think this part of the argument really just doesn't, I think we can discount it. Okay, let's move. As a matter of fact, that's why the density bonus exists. It's to incentivize developers to put an underground parking lot when it wouldn't be in their financial interest otherwise. Okay, let's now move to number 3. This has to do with Landmark's recommendation that the design that they are proposing minimizes the risk of vapor migration into the building. In other words, it would be safer to have a building which is on stilts with a parking garage at ground level as opposed to a building